Opposite colored bishop endgames have a reputation for being drawish. And that's mostly the case. I actually, in a tournament game a while back, I had an opponent who offered me a draw in the middle game because we had traded a couple of pieces and we had opposite colored bishops on the board. Even though there were like lots of pawns and a bunch of other pieces, like the rooks were still on the boards, the queens might have even been, probably the queens were off the board. Anyway, it was not a draw. I actually went on to win that game. But the point is, opposite colored bishops do have a reputation of being drawish, and they are often a draw, but not always. And particularly if the strong side is up 2 pawns, there are quite a few winning chances. Although, even being up 2 pawns doesn't guarantee anything. It could still be a draw with opposite colored bishops. So it's worth studying these endgames and understanding what the different cases are so that you can, earn that win or earn the draw in a tournament when you know that's something that you should be able to achieve. So this is going to be a 2-part video series. In the first part, we're going to look at opposite colored bishop endings where the strong side has connected pawns or pawns that are only separated by 1 file. And then in part 2, we're going to talk about the other cases where the pawns are more separated, which interestingly increases the winning chances. Usually having connected pawns is better, but in this case, having them more separated makes it easier for the strong side to win. So let's jump right in here. So first of all, let's just cover like a super basic case. If the strong side is only up 1 pawn, and I'm going to be talking about like very basic endings, but these can be traded down to if there are more pawns on the board and so on. First of all, the simple case of when the strong side only has a single pawn. This one is pretty easy. It's pretty easy because it is a draw if the defending bishop covers the square in front of that pawn. And the reason is this pawn cannot make any progress. And if the strong side tries to make progress by, for example, moving the king up and trying to support pushing that pawn, it doesn't actually work because after the pawn push, the defending side can just simply take it anyway. And after capturing the bishop, yes, you've given up a bishop for a pawn, but now it's a draw because of insufficient material. You can't checkmate a king with only a bishop and a king, right? So that's the simple case, but I want to talk about cases where the strong side actually is up 2 pawns. And specifically, as I mentioned, let's talk about, in this video, the case where those pawns are connected. So first of all, if those pawns have already made it to the 6th rank, then it is probably a win. Almost always. There are a few exceptions, and I'll show you one of them later, but it's almost always a win. Now, it is a win, but you need to know the technique. You need to know the procedure, because if you just simply try to push this pawn right away, then the defending side can just capture it, and then they will win both pawns for the 1 bishop. And now, again, bishop and king versus king, it's a draw, right? So back to the start here. What you need to do, instead of pushing this pawn right away, you need to first ask the king where it's going. This king needs, so we deliver a check, and this king needs to decide which direction it's going to go. And then whichever direction it goes, if it goes to d8, for example, now the strong king is going to go to the other side, is going to go on the other direction. This is a technique called outflanking, where we go out on the other flank, basically. And no matter what the defending side does, we can bring this king in front of our pawns, and now we're supporting this promotion. So or supporting the push rather. So if we push that pawn, even if black takes here, we capture, and now black cannot capture our last pawn, and we are going to promote. And this works as well in the other direction. I'll just show you really quick. If the king decides to go this way instead, for example, then we just outflank on this side. We can't go here because of the bishop, but we can outflank around on the light squares. And so we do that, and now once again we're supporting the advance of this pawn, and black can trade off the bishop all they want, but we are going to promote this pawn. So there is a defensive setup that works in some cases, and that is when the bishop is in front of the pawns. But I'm going to show you how that works. But first, I'm going to show you that actually still doesn't work with pawns that are on the 6th rank. So the ideal defensive setup for this bishop is it's attacking one of the pawns and it's covering the advancement square of the other pawn, right? So this would be the ideal setup, and this would work if the pawns were back a little bit. If they were on the 5th rank or further back, then this would work as a defensive setup. But in this case, it doesn't. Now, once again, we can't just push here because, we trade off 2 pawns for a bishop and it's a draw. But we can go with our typical plan here at first. But now the king has moved this way. Our typical plan would be to do outflanking on this side, but then that's going to drop this pawn. And so what we need to do instead is a Zugzwang. So we're going to play the king over here, and now, unfortunately, black has to move, and black doesn't want to move. So black is covering this square with both their bishop and their king, but one of those pieces is going to have to move. Either the bishop has to move away, and now we get to push this pawn, and it's going to promote on the next move, or where is it? There we are. Or the king is going to move out of the way, and now this pawn is going to make it through. Even if we trade off here, it looks like maybe the king is in time to save it, but the bishop is covering the promotion square, and so it is a win. And yeah, as I mentioned, in this position, outflanking here doesn't work because we lose this pawn. And now we're back to the first case I showed you where we're only up 1 pawn and the bishop is covering the square in front of that pawn. And so this is a draw. One exception here for pawns on the 6th rank is when they're on the edge of the board. So in this case, it's black to play, which is why black is in check right now. Pawns on the edge of the board actually this can be a draw. Black can draw this if the defending bishop is on this long diagonal, and if it is the correct bishop, if it's the bishop that covers this corner. And how that looks is when the king moves out of check, so it moves this way, which means that normally we would try to do outflanking over here, but of course there's no room. We're at the edge of the board, right? And so we can't get around on that side, and we can't make progress this way either because this bishop is covering, and white just simply can't make progress. Black just needs to, wait on this diagonal. If we ever try to push this pawn, we're just going to trade off the bishop for both pawns, and it is a draw. So what about if the pawns are a little bit further back? If the pawns are on the 5th rank, or 5th rank or further back, I should say, then there is a defensive setup that works. Now, the defending side isn't always going to be able to get to this defensive setup. If the pawns are further back, then the defending side has more chances of getting to this setup. But if they can't make it to this setup, then it's going to be a win for the stronger side again. In this case, the defending side, black in this case, has attained the defensive setup. As I mentioned before, the bishop is attacking one of the pawns and also covering the square in front of the other pawn. So the bishop is on the correct diagonal. And so if we deliver a check and then the king moves off to the side, now we're going to want to, normally we would want to do outflanking on this side. But the problem is we can't move this king because the bishop is covering this pawn. If we move the king, then we just simply lose this pawn, and it's a draw. It's a draw anyway, but that's why we can't do our typical setup. And so, we can shuffle around, but we can't make progress, basically. So you can see that if the king kind of tries to go over here, then black can just simply shuffle around with the bishop. If we try to go back, again, we just shuffle around. We can't push the pawn because then, as we've seen several times already, we just trade off, and this is a draw. So as I mentioned, this defensive setup is easier to attain the further back the pawns are. And sometimes in this kind of case, the defending side can't actually get to this setup. So in this case, this is kind of a more extreme case, but the defending bishop is on the wrong diagonal. It wants to be on this diagonal, and white can make progress before the defending bishop can get in the right place. But white does have to be pretty precise here. And this is the kind of thing that I'm not so sure I would come up with in a game scenario, because it does require very precise calculation. But we have to deliver a check on this side. I think the check over here doesn't actually work for various reasons. And then we need to, the king is going to go on this side, and then we need to do outflanking on this side of the board. And again, this bishop is on the wrong diagonal. It just doesn't have enough time to get like over here onto the correct diagonal before we start pushing these pawns, because it always has to be covering the advancement square of this pawn. And so we eventually make our way around and get to this square where we want to be, and then we can push this pawn. And, the rest is history. We end up, I guess the rest isn't history, I should say. We end up pushing this king back and then moving our king in behind the pawns, which we can do now because now we push the second one and we have the pawns on the 6th rank. And we know already that this is a win. We might have to maneuver around a little bit in order to make this push happen or this push happen, whichever one. But it is a win for white. So those are the cases I wanted to cover when the pawns are connected. There's one other case I want to jump into here, which is when we have separated pawns that are separated by one file. Now, separated pawns are, the cases can get a little bit complicated, and so that's why I've moved most of them to part 2, to a second video, which will be coming out shortly after this one. But this case is pretty simple. When the pawns are separated by only one file, the thing is, the defending king can be in a blockading position where it is covering both of them. It is preventing both of them from pushing forward. And this is the case that draws. Any other case wins. So it's a draw if the king can blockade both of those pawns and the defending bishop can cover the side that the strong king is covering. So in this case, this king is here. It's trying to support the promotion of this pawn. So as long as the defending bishop stays on this diagonal, preventing this advancement, then we're good. We can defend this. And so this may look something like this. The bishop just stays on this diagonal, and the king might start to walk around, and we're just going to keep, shuffling on this diagonal. And then once the king makes it over here where it is trying to support the push of this pawn, now our bishop just simply stays on this diagonal, and white can't make any progress from here. It is absolutely a draw. If the king and the bishop can't reach this defensive setup, then it's a win. The side with two pawns separated by one file can win this. So those are the cases I wanted to cover today. Mostly connected pawns. To recap, if they're on the 6th rank, then it's probably a win unless they're on the side of the board and the bishop is on the long diagonal. And also this case where they're separated by one file. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, part 2 is coming soon, where we'll talk about some more complicated cases of separated pawns that are separated by 2 or 3 or more files. And interestingly, those cases are actually more likely to be a win, unlike a lot of cases where connected pawns are better. In this case, because the pawns are more separated and they're harder to defend with both the king and the bishop, there are more winning chances. So stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed this or learned something new about opposite colored bishop endgames, then definitely hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.